Well, it's my pleasure to be here with Dr. Crystal Downing and Dr. David Downing, who together are the co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center and co-holders of the Marion E. Wade Chair in Christian Thought at Wheaton College in Illinois. For those of you unfamiliar with it, Wheaton, or the Wade Center at Wheaton, is this marvelous archive that has the books and papers of 7 British authors, including C.S. Lewis, and all these authors provide a unique combination of intellect and imagination and faith. Those other authors are J.R.R. Tolkien, Dorothy L. Sayers, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams. Crystal Downing has authored 5 books in which her compelling crispness has made easy a way for us to understand the relationships between such diverse pairings as faith and postmodernity, truth and symbol, salvation and cinema. And 2 of her books focus on Dorothy L. Sayers, including her most recent book that Ben mentioned, Subversive Christ, Culture, and the Shocking Dorothy L. Sayers. David Downing is the author of 4 award-winning books on C.S. Lewis, Planets in Peril, The Most Reluctant Convert, one of my personal favorites, Into Regions of Awe, and Into the Wardrobe. But the most impressive thing about David is that years ago when he was visiting his twin brother who was going to ASU, he talked to that generation of ASU students about C.S. Lewis and kept on talking about C.S. Lewis. And afterwards, everybody started reading C.S. Lewis here at ASU. So that's really amazing. But it's great to have you both with us today. So we'll start a question about Lewis being very concerned that knowledge that can be verified through the scientific method is not the only sort of knowledge we encounter. So why is the loss of shared knowledge about virtue, the rejection of the idea of objective value, why is that dehumanizing?
I think this goes back to his second chapter on the Tao. Last night, Paul Davies was talking about all the mathematics behind the physical world, and you're surprised to find that there are these invisible principles that connect planets and galaxies. And he said some people just stop with the connection and they don't ask, why is that there? Why is the universe so rational? Another physicist said it's almost as if you found out that the universe were playing by the rules of chess. What you thought was a human construction actually turns to be built into the universe. Lewis would argue in the same way there's mathematics behind the physical universe, there's the Tao, the way that all cultures discover behind the social universe, human beings, what we have here in the world. And he's trying to argue that if you ignore the Tao or you take one strand out of the Tao, this is this tapestry of all sorts of moral values, duties to parents, duties to posterity, integrity, humility, empathy. Last night I would like to hear the word empathy more often. They were talking about virtues. And this concept continues to be relevant. I just heard a speaker a few weeks ago say that the great mistake of the Nazis, of course, was to take love of kin and turn that into the ultimate value. We can do anything in the name of the master race. And so they forgot about justice. They forgot about mercy. But by the same token, the communists, the Bolsheviks took one value, the concern for posterity and equality. We're going to create a perfect society in the future. And then they performed really unnameable cruelties to people who didn't go along with the program. So we keep seeing that if you either ignore the Tao altogether, or if you try to take one strand out of the Tao and make that your whole moral philosophy, you're going to have an extremely dehumanized society and a total disregard for individuals.
That is a great point about the idea of tapestry, that the Tao itself is pluralistic and we need to weave together rather than create an idol of one particular objective value just by celebrating, well, this is objective, posterity. I was struck by how the Tao operates just on my way here yesterday, because we drove past multiple signs, and I'm sure they're down here in Phoenix as well, but in Chicagoland, where you see yard signs that are saying injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's an appeal to the Tao. The Tao, a value that transcends your race, your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, etc. But then in the plane, while people were just filling the aisles to use the restroom, I overheard a man with who said to the woman with a young, maybe 3-year-old behind her, say, "Oh, go ahead, you go first." And I don't think he was just assuming, okay, I have to fulfill my religious duty right now. He was just recognizing that there was a need, and a child probably has more need to get to that restroom. But then the mother responded immediately afterwards and said, say thank you, Billy. So she was transmitting her sense of the appreciation for the other to this person who had just demonstrated unselfishness. So we see the Tao practiced around us in many different ways, but we forget that it is an appeal to the truth claims that even transcend our various religious positionalities.
This is a bit of practical morality for our audience here. If the same thing happened to you and you're in line waiting for the bathroom on an airplane, also an old man behind you like me, go ahead and let them go in front of you. It's the same principle. But they probably need to go more than you do. So
protecting the elderly.
That's right.
So Lewis is very concerned that this collective wisdom of humanity be passed on to the next generation. Lewis was also concerned, he talks in the Abolition of Man, concerned that people not be easily misled, that they not be duped by propaganda. So in what ways is teaching the moral good to young people different from propaganda?
Well, I think propaganda usually involves a set ideology that you're trying to transmit to the next generation, and it doesn't allow for a lot of discussion. We have some Russian and Eastern European scholars coming to the Wade Center, and they say that in the late 80s and early 90s, when communism fell, there was this huge moral vacuum because they'd been taught to be good citizens, good workers, to support the government, even to turn in family members if you felt they were being subversive. So I think ideology has to do with propaganda has to do with propagating an ideology, whereas moral education has to do with cultivating virtues that could be applied to a number of different political affiliations or social standards.
One thing important to remember is that about a decade after Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man, he wrote another text called The Discarded Image, where he makes the point that different generations operate by different models. And so we are inevitably seeing the Tao through a particular model of our own time. And so part of this then is to have a self-awareness of what is that model. And we have to think of the context in which Lewis wrote this book. As Michael Ward made clear, logical positivism was at its height. Logical positivism was just assuming no language other than language that affirms something that's empirically verifiable is legitimate. And also, basically, this was the height of modernism, this assumption that humanity is progressing. And so that was a particular model of truth that had to be problematized. So we always have to be questioning, what is the model through which I am perceiving reality? And of course, Lewis is writing in the middle of World War II, where the model, the modernist model that had been promoted for so long, and all the intellectuals were supporting it, scientists, even literary artists, visual artists, was eugenics. We've got to improve the race. We've got to use evolution for the betterment of posterity. So they were appealing to something in the Tao, but of course it became perverted and led to the eugenics implemented by Hitler and the Nazis. You get rid of anything that sullies the supremacy, especially of one race.
So one of Lewis's solutions that he mentions in The Abolition of Man is the idea that we must have humility with all the models that we use. The models, whatever model we're using that speaks a lot about truth that can be improved upon, we need to be humble about that. So in that sense, there's never really a settled science. So how do we live with unsettled science when so often there's the call from the press and from the average person, what's the settled science? How do we bridge that? How do we deal with that?
I think it has to do with underlying values, and sometimes the Tao can actually evolve when an underlying value becomes more prominent. In the classical world, slavery existed and was accepted, and it's not openly condemned in Scripture. Before you have a monetary economy, it's hard to figure out how to get people to do menial labor, and their solution was force. Our solution now is incentives, monetary incentives. But at one point in history, slavery seemed acceptable, and now it's one of the most greatest abominations that we can think of. Even the idea of taking prisoners of war, it's not rational to take prisoners of war. If you won the battle, you should slaughter them all. Otherwise, you have to feed them, you have to guard them. They might escape and come back and fight you again. And there's a certain advance in moral sensibilities to say, we are going to go to this extra trouble to keep prisoners of war. That's a fairly new innovation. But I think what it is an underlying principle of the Tao, such as the dignity of the human being. A Christian would say everyone is made in the image of God, but even others can recognize the underlying value of humanity. So I think the secret has to do with finding the underlying fundamentals of the Tao as opposed to a surface expression in one society or another.
And what goes along with that is then constantly interrogating one's own model. What I find interesting, and one of the issues that comes up, how is Abolition of Man still relevant in our own era? It was not long after, well, a couple decades after Lewis wrote this, that you start having postmodern theorists saying the exact same thing Lewis was saying about models of our understanding of truth. And a lot of people, they haven't read postmodern theory, they don't understand it. But someone like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, they were questioning the model that Lewis was questioning, which was this idea that humanity is progressing, it's evolutionary psychology, that things of the past are simplistic, hence we have evolved beyond the need for religion. Even when I was in grad school in the 1980s, I had fellow students who would come up to me because I didn't hide my light under a bushel. And I had one actually say to me, "Crystal, you're the first Christian I've ever met who's the least bit intelligent." And that person thinks he is appealing to objective truth, that Christianity is stupid. He is not realizing he is operating under a particular model. And so people like Derrida and Foucault, like C.S. Lewis, were getting us aware of models and challenging this progressivism. And what's interesting is that one of the biggest ways that people under the modernist model, how they attacked, and this was the most severe attack they could make on Foucault and Derrida's, well, they're basically conservative, because they allowed the possibility that religious paradigms may be better models for understanding truth.
So Lewis is arguing against what he terms elsewhere as the poison of subjectivism. So how does unbridled skepticism, subjectivism, how does that destroy the sciences?
Well, he has this wonderful passage on reductionism. And if you could always say, well, here's what's going on in psychology. Well, actually, that's the movement of molecules in your brain. It's really biology. Well, actually, biology is just organic chemistry. Chemistry, well, that's physics, basically, as we were talking about last night. I recently read a physicist who said, everything that we experience in life is just emergent phenomena. At the quantum level, everything is just information. And he said even black holes, all they're doing is absorbing information. They're not really absorbing light and matter. So he was trying to get very basic about what fundamental reality is. But I think that that kind of reductionism, ultimately, how far do you go? Lewis says a window should be clear so we can see outside and see the yard and see the street in front of us. But what if the yard were transparent? What if the street were transparent? Ultimately, if everything's transparent, if we can see through it, then we can't see anything. It leads to an ultimate blindness. I thought that was an interesting analogy of the dangers of reductionism. I heard a doctor once, for a while people were saying, you know, the human body is only worth 27 cents. And the doctor is saying, well, that's if you get down to basic chemicals. But if you start talking about the higher complexity of the organs, heart transplants, liver transplants, all the other kinds of things, he said human bodies are worth thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. It's very reductionistic to take it down to just the chemicals. And I think sometimes people do the same thing with reality in general. They lose the value because they've gotten so reductionistic.
One of the things I noticed as I was reading Abolition of Man again for this conference is how Lewis anticipates what Jacques Derrida did. Is called deconstruction. And it's showing, basically, deconstruction is illuminating how people are naive to their own models under which they are operating. And a perfect example of that I saw at least 5 times that Lewis was practicing deconstruction as it came to be known. And one of them is by highlighting the authors of this book. And Michael Ward didn't mention the fact, but Abolition of Man was written in response to a book called The Control of Language. Right. And it is a book then, and we have it, it's called The Green Book, and we have it at the Wade Center, and we have Lewis's annotations in the margins. You know, this is really fun to have as he's reading this book, and it's going, confusion, confounded. And
what is the color of the book we have at the Wade Center?
The green, it's green.
It's actually green, yeah.
So anyway, part of the Green Book that Lewis is reacting to, the authors are saying, well, value is just, it's all subjective. And Lewis deconstructs that by saying, yes, but they're saying everything is subjective except for that very statement of theirs that everything is subjective. They're saying that is objective. They have undermined their own argument. That is an example of deconstruction. Another example of it is anybody who says, well, everything is relative. A person who says that, I mean, it's very naive because they're implying that, well, everything's relative, except this statement I just made that everything is relative. So their own language undermines what they are trying to say. And this is, and Lewis does this several times in Abolition of Man, and why it's still a relevant text.
He does that also with Marxists and Freudians. Marxists say, well, you're not thinking objectively because you're blinded by class loyalties. And Freudians say you're not thinking objectively because you have emotional complexes that are subliminal and you don't know that they're influencing and distorting your thinking. And Lewis says, well, how come Freudians seem to be free from emotional complexes and Marxists seem to be free from class interest? So he often does that. He turns their argument on themselves to show that you can't really escape the Tao. You use one part of the Tao to critique another part of the Tao.
And this highlights one of the values that Lewis lifts up in the appendix, those 8 things he thinks and is able to show anecdotally are reflected in cultures throughout history and the various societies. One of those is what he calls the law of good faith and veracity. So how is honesty crucial to the sciences?
It's good. I mean, we got into this, the wonderful conversation last night that the scientist becomes honest to his or her own desires, their experimentation, their research. And when it becomes problematic is when somebody has decided in advance what they want to prove, and they have, if they are totally committed to, well, I know this is right. In fact, part of the reason Freud fell out of favor, as I understand it, is that it was discovered that several times he just changed the results of his evidence. And he said, well, I know this was supposed to be true, so that experiment just didn't work. So honesty is a willingness to sacrifice your own certitude in what you're trying to prove.
I think another difference in the humanities, knowledge or insight isn't quite as cumulative. I can read a good essay on Shakespeare by Samuel Johnson or Coleridge, which is still valid. The sciences tend to be much more cumulative. When I was teaching at a college before I came to Wheaton, they had a case where one of the professors had falsified data in order to publish articles in order to get tenure. And I was rather amazed at the emotional ferocity of the colleagues when this came out, because other people would want to build on this work. So if you're plagiarizing the humanities, I'm not recommending plagiarism, but in a way, you've done a disservice to the author, you've done a disservice to your fellow students because you're using someone else's work as your own, and you've done a disservice to the professor because they're evaluating you on what they assume is your work. But nobody necessarily is going to build on that paper that included some plagiarism. But if you falsify an experiment, you may waste a lot of people's time trying to replicate that experiment or try to build upon that. So I think honesty, obviously it's a virtue in all the disciplines, but I think it's even more pragmatically crucial in the sciences.
So David, you started to talk about what science can learn from the humanities, and I want to delve into that a little bit more deeply. Lewis proposes that when we explain nature, that we be cautious that we don't explain it away. For instance, we can't focus on the data related to a particular tree to such an extent we lose a sense of the beauty of that tree or the grandeur of the forest. So what other ways can the sciences and the humanities learn from one another?
When I was in grad school in English, we were reading Michael Polanyi, who's a philosopher of science. We were reading Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because I was in grad school right at the time where people were overcoming the modernist model that C.S. Lewis was problematizing. And so there is this conversation between, and of course, Polanyi is talking about personal knowledge. And what's interesting is Polanyi, as a philosopher of science, in a 1970s book called Meaning, he quotes approvingly C.S. Lewis. So there is, how might, my field is literary scholarship, and I'm a cultural critic as well, but how much might my study of literature and film illuminate the models under which we are assessing how we understand objective value? And I'll let David speak, and then I have a good example of that after he gets in his 2 bits.
Well, Lewis makes the point, if you like Abolition of Man, where he talks about how quickly science can become scientism, it can become a scientific worldview. He wrote a novel called That Hideous Strength, and he actually recommends that you read it in conjunction with The Abolition of Man. But one of the characters is a sociologist, and he wants to eliminate this certain undesirable classes and transport them somewhere far away from Oxford. And they're merely an abstraction in his mind. But when he goes to visit the village, he sees a woman who reminds him of his aunt, and he sees all these children, and he actually sees the suffering of their poverty and their deprivation. And I think sometimes literature, humanity can be very good about awakening the imagination. We're not just talking about numbers. We're not talking about abstractions such as the undesirable class. And often I've had science colleagues who will use a novel to illustrate something going on in the sciences. They want the students to have a concrete, imagined experience, not just a mathematical model or a scientific model.
That's interesting. David brought up the first in the Ransom trilogy, Out of a Silent Planet, because that's relevant to what I was going to talk about, the cross-fertilization between science and literature. And there is this fantastic book. It was written in the 60s, but again, I think in response to this modernist view of just only scientifically verifiable details can be called true. And she quotes from Out of the Silent Planet. It's a book called Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory, that Lewis actually, when he goes to another planet, his character goes to another planet, Ransom, he can't understand what he's looking at because he doesn't have a model to be able to see it. It's there, it's factual, and he actually says, you have to be educated in order to see. And that kind of goes back to Abolition of Man, was a response to this Green Book who just wanted to educate people that everything is subjective, except for empirically verifiable evidence.
Can I tell where that example came from, Out of the Silent Planet?
Yeah.
When Lewis was a little boy, the first time he visited the beach, he grew up in Belfast, Ireland, and they drove up to the coast to see the ocean. And he was only 3 or 4, and he saw this vast blue expanse, but he didn't have the perspective of looking out. He'd never been that wide open of a horizon. And it looked to him like a gigantic wall of water that was just about to crash down on the beach. And at first he was very anxious until he slowly realized he was looking out at the blue expanse. He wasn't looking up at a blue wall. And I think that's why in Out of the Silent Planet, he says, you can't really see something unless you know what it is. You have some prior model of what you're looking at before you can actually see it.
And he transmutes that experience, I think, into any of you who have read the Narnia stories, you know about Reepicheep, wonderful Reepicheep, and he's out in this little coracle, and he just sees a wall of water. And so he gives this little heroic mouse the same impression of water that C.S. Lewis had as a little boy. One of the problems with the abolition of man is that, and this goes back to the book I was just talking about that quotes from, ironically, C.S. Lewis, is it starts with something that really bothered Lewis in the Green Book, and that was an incident talking about a waterfall. And is it sublime? Is it beautiful? And it's like, some people think it's pretty, some people think it's not. And so Lewis wants to say, well, there's objective value behind the waterfall. But what you will discover is if you go back and study literature in the 17th century, and Lewis loved Milton, he loved the metaphysical poets, but there are a lot of, that wasn't his specialty, the 17th century literature. And what you discover in the 17th century is that mountains and waterfalls were considered ugly. And she has this 300-page book that quotes poem, essay after essay, poem after poem, describing the horror, the terror of seeing mountains. And they're described, even by John Donne, mountains are warts and pimples on the face of the earth. Waterfalls look like the pus flowing out of the pimples, described as scrofulous scum.
Thank you for that image, Crystal. Stay with me.
And I use such a dramatic image to show that many values that we think are universal. Of course, everybody will see a waterfall as beautiful. No, we see them through the models that we have inherited. Now, there is a transcendent truth that beauty is valuable, but different generations see beauty in different ways. And Jennifer Wiseman was getting to this in last night's, and I point to the screen because she was on the screen. But what started changing that attitude? And you go, well, why would they have that model? Well, because early on in Jewish midrash, mountains were considered a result of the fall. It was human sin. And like when Adam and Eve fell, and some midrash says it's when Cain killed Abel, and the earth just started cracking up, and it just became so ugly. Whereas the greatest beauty is smoothness, proportion. So of course, mountains are going to be ugly. One 17th century king in France built a castle, and he put no windows on the side that looked at the Alps because the Alps are so ugly. So why did it change? Well, Galileo started talking about there's mountains on the moon. Well, they knew there weren't people on the moon. So maybe mountains weren't the result of the fall. And it started getting people to question their own model of how you even see beauty.
I think it's time to start looking at some questions from the audience. And the first one is about the pandemic. How do you think our practice of the Tao has been damaged by the pandemic?
I think one of the basic principles of the Tao, and yes, hence of science, of all intellectual fields, is openness to the other, which ironically, that's how Jacques Derrida defined deconstruction: openness to the other, being willing to question your model, that maybe seeing waterfalls as one poem describes it, I think I mentioned the scrofulous scum. Maybe other people in another generation might see this as beautiful. So this openness to change your mind, that perhaps, yes, the Tao exists, but the way my culture sees it. So now, to go back to the pandemic, is openness to the other means sensitivity to sacrifice, one's own self-interest, one's own comfort, like a scientist willing to sacrifice his or her certitude about what he or she thinks is going to be proved by this experiment. And to wear masks even though they're annoying, to be sensitive to needs of the other rather than, oh, this just is a real inconvenience to myself.
There's an old proverb, the same sun melts butter and hardens clay. And I think in some ways, COVID is a kind of sun which brings out people's moral nature. It's easy to be friendly and cooperative when everything's going well and the people aren't having to make sacrifices for each other. So I've seen more admirable behavior of caregivers for either family members or professional caregivers, the level of sacrifice. And then I've seen more selfish behavior where people say, I don't want anybody interfering with my freedoms. So in a way, I think it's one of those kinds of adversity that brings out people's true nature, gives them a chance for moral growth. There's a great novel called The Plague by Camus, and things are going well in North Africa and Iran, and then they get an old-fashioned plague with rats, and I think it's the bubonic plague. And it really brings out people's underlying character, which people really rally to help the community and which people do everything they can to protect themselves from the plague. So this is kind of a new plague, I think.
And that goes back to Abolition of Man, where one of the motifs that Lewis ties together his text is the importance of sacrifice. Sacrificing your own interests, your own convenience, your own desires for money, celebrity, status, sacrificing even your tenure possibilities as whether a scientist or a literary scholar.
Why are you looking at me? Are you going to take away my tenure?
No, because you gave the example from
Oh, okay.
college.
I thought you knew something I didn't know. Okay.
Another person in the audience raised the issue about, or the perspective that wasn't Lewis sexist, wasn't he too involved in a colonial perspective? So how can he begin talking about the good and a sense of collective morality if he was so conditioned by his time and by those things?
That's a good question. There's a number of critiques. Some of his examples aren't that well chosen. He says the Roman father told the Roman son that it's sweet and seemly to die for your country. And I think that's a mid-century British perspective. They felt that they were always involved in just wars. Other people would disagree. You can actually, I've had people come into the Wade and say, well, he talks about the Tao, and yet the Chinese for a long time have allowed infanticide, especially if you have you have a female baby. It's right. Not that. So you can talk about it in the abstract, but cultures always fall short and individuals always fall short. There's a new book written in the 80s called After Virtue by Alistair McGrath. And he says that going all the way back to Aristotle, there was always a sense of humans as they are and humans as they should be. And he says we need a morality that says we shouldn't stop where we are, we need to go on to where we should be. Lewis, I think, was sexist in his, I would say, more condescending toward women and Americans in his early years. I think as he got older and met more really intelligent women, he overcame that quite a bit. But Lewis is not setting himself up because he's aware of a moral law. That doesn't mean he's always going to make the right moral choice. You can know higher mathematics and you can still be making mistakes in your computations.
One of Bruce's questions had to do with subjectivity, and one of the benefits, and again, this is echoing Lewis, that what postmodern theorists were doing, especially Derrida and Foucault, is saying, no, it's not about subjectivity, it's about our subjection to the discursive practices of the time in which we live. And this radicalized things by saying we inevitably absorb the linguistic practices of our time. And Lewis did, and he uses male pronouns. He reflects the male privilege of his time. His good friend, Dorothy Sayers, challenged him. She wrote one person and said, everything that Lewis knows about women he got out of Milton. But she's making the point of this, you don't accuse him of sexism, you accuse the time. This reflects the practices of when he was writing. And even Dorothy Sayers, who wrote a book called an essay called Are Women Human? When she's writing one of her detective novels, when she's writing about, she's describing a woman who has just been stabbed and is bleeding on a bed, and she writes, dead men don't bleed. And you go, well, it's a woman. But that was the practice. Man was the word, the universalizing word. And we all know about that. So rather than accusing someone of being insensitive, and this goes back to even this answer about how do we respond during the time of pandemics, we think, okay, how can the discourse or the model of the time explain this, rather than accusing him, oh, you're so sexist, you're so racist, you're so et cetera.
We have a question about how Christians can use the way in relating to people of various faiths. How can we use the truth that we as Christians share the truth without making people uncomfortable? How can we be gracious when we talk about our own faith?
Well, Lewis in Mere Christianity built upon Abolition of Man. These are a series of 3 academic lectures. In Mere Christianity, he's on the BBC talking to everyone listening on the radio. And rather than starting out by the Tao, which is a very intellectual construct, he says, we've all overheard an argument. One person saying, I was here first, you took my seat, I gave you a piece of candy, why won't you give me a piece of candy? And he says, all these arguments assume a shared standard of fairness. And the more you think about it, we can think of times that you haven't been fair. I was driving on a busy road recently, and I had trouble getting into traffic, so I just kind of barged in, and the person behind me honked. And I said, well, if you hadn't been going so fast, you wouldn't have had to slow down. Then about 2 blocks later, I was going down this busy avenue, and a guy comes out of a driveway and cuts me off. And I'm kind of going, what's the matter with you? You know, be more patient. So within about 5 minutes, I went from thinking, this person is wrong because he honked at me, and this person is wrong because he cut me off. So Lewis starts on a very universal level of our own behavior. We're all aware of a standard of right and wrong, and we're all aware that we're not keeping to that standard. And so something about human brokenness, or kind of, Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing very straight can be built. And so I think sometimes we all feel that, yes, we are part of the crooked timber of humanity. So that would be a starting point, I think, to talk about what Christians mean by original sin.
Part of the reason I titled my book Subversive on Dorothy Sayers, and basically, the reason I titled it that is it's related to everything I've been talking about, is that perhaps we can more effectively communicate our commitments, how we understand the Tao, our religious perspectives, is if we use new language. One of my books is actually called Changing Signs of Truth. And as far as I am concerned, as a Christian, the fundamental truths of Christian orthodoxy do not change. But the signs we use to talk about them must change as culture changes. And the trouble is, too often Christians get so committed to the signs they use that only if you use these signs is it authentic Christianity. But signs are just pointers to the truth. And Dorothy Sayers provides the perfect example, is that she wrote a series of radio plays about the death, the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But it came out in a press conference that she didn't use King James English. And Christians all over England rose up in protest. They demanded censorship. They wrote letters to Winston Churchill and the Archbishop of Canterbury. This was 1941. So in middle of the war, too, I think there was more protectivism about the way we've always done things. And it was actually discussed in Parliament. It was such a controversy. And worse, Sayers not only didn't use King James English, she used slang for the disciples. And of course, the disciples were, most of them, working class. Of course, they spoke slang. But worse yet, those of you standing may want to sit down. Some of it was American slang.
Oh my goodness.
This was the headlines of papers in London. Plays about Jesus and American slang. And Sayers was strong. She was feisty. BBC radio stood with her. But because she refused to idolize King James English, thousands of people tuned in who normally wouldn't listen to religious broadcasting, because she changed the language. She didn't change the truth. And And she got, and I say thousands, and she wrote this to C.S. Lewis. I got thousands of letters from people telling me that for the first time in their lives, they understood how Jesus was relevant to their slang-slinging lives.
So, Crystal, the very next question is also about how we communicate now. How can we make sense of one another? It is how can humility apply in a postmodern world where everybody is talking about my truth rather than the truth? How can we talk about humility? How can we make that understandable?
I wanted to give a different example of rhetorical finesse that had to do with having empathy with the listener. Sometimes humility has to do with what are their values, where are they coming from? When I went to Boulder back in the day, University of Colorado at Boulder, and there were black and white signs. A lot of people have been cutting across the squares, and they were leaving paths in the grass. And there was a sign in black and white that said, "Keep off the grass." And clearly it was not working. You could see that there were dirt paths developing. And about a month into the semester, all the signs changed to green and white. And they said, "Give Earth a chance. Please use sidewalks." And it was more polite, and it was appealing to the values of the students themselves. We all want to be ecologically sensitive. And sure enough, by the end of the semester, many of those paths had healed up again because it was the same message, but they changed the rhetoric and they built upon the values of the person who was reading the sign rather than just authoritatively saying, "Here's what you need to do." I think that's a small example of what Christians can do. How does our rhetoric really listen to the other person and make appeal to their values rather than trying to dictate to the other person?
And that humility is the willingness to question one's own model rather than stand up and feel this defensiveness, to be aware of how our minds have been molded by language. What was very good for my own faith is I grew up in kind of a fundagelical background. And when people say, "Are you a Christian?" certain language I would use to respond. Yes, I asked Jesus into my heart when I was 8 years old and I was born again. Case closed, move on. And then I taught at a college in Pennsylvania, where you can be among the Amish in 15 minutes from our house. And I was at a college that was of the tradition of Amish and Mennonites. And I heard someone talking in chapel my first semester of this new job, teaching English, and he was talking about a Mennonite man of God was asked, "Are you a Christian?" And so I, in my mind, thought of the way I was trained to answer that. And once again, it was just, if you use the right language, that proves the truth. And the Mennonite man of God answered the question, "Are you a Christian?" with, "Ask my neighbor." I nearly fell off my chair. And it was a different way of seeing things. That is humility. If my neighbor can't see any difference in my life, no matter how articulate I am, no matter how many Bible verses I have memorized, it doesn't make a difference.
No. Crystal, David, thank you very much for being with us. There'll be time to talk with the Downings at lunch, but we want to thank you for your time with us today. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.